Hey, everybody, welcome back to another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. I'm your host, Omar Zaran. Thank you, as always, for joining me on another episode of the podcast. Recording this on December 27th, so hope everybody had a good holiday, a good Christmas if you celebrate Christmas, a happy Hanukkah, a happy Kwanzaa, or whatever it is you celebrate. Or maybe you just enjoyed the day off. So, there's something I want to talk about this week. Again, centers around college sports, which has been, I think, one of the most fascinating sports and happenings in the sports landscape. There's been so much change and so much pivoting and adjusting done by the institutions of college basketball, college football, and others that I just find kind of fascinating. And I want to talk about one of those that kind of crosses the realm of both football and basketball. And that's this growing trend of these kind of lifer college coaches leaving the game, retiring, and deciding that what the sport has become or what college athletics have become is no longer tenable for them. And, I thought about making this episode, this topic, after Tony Bennett stepped down at Virginia for basketball. And then you also have had the ongoing commentary from Nick Saban, who obviously retired from Alabama football last year, and just recently Jim Larinaga from the University of Miami, Florida's basketball team also retired. The common thread here is not that these coaches feel like they couldn't coach anymore, because I think they all three of them were at successful programs. Larinaga recently led Miami to a Final Four. Saban obviously is the most decorated college coach ever. Bennett was consistently leading Virginia to deep runs in the ACC tournament and 1 and 2 seeds in the NCAA tournament. So they could still coach, right? It's not that they washed up and the game passed them by or something like that. Every single one of them has talked about transfer portal and NIL as the main impetus for them wanting to leave college. And a lot of it has been commentary on the fact that this is a professional free agency dynamic. This is not what they signed up for when they started coaching 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So I kind of wanted to discuss that and whether the coaches have a point or are they just dinosaurs that have passed them by. And I think a lot of people, in a weird way, tend to side with the coaches here because of all the tremendous amount of change that's been happening in college basketball and football. So I kind of want to get into it. To, I think, properly understand the context here is that college coaches in many ways have been a monarchy over their programs for many, many years. So you are a college coach. That means that you are in charge of obviously coaching on the field or on the court. You're in charge of getting players in there. You're kind of the face of the program because in basketball you might lose a player every year, but in football you would lose them after 2, 3, or 4 years. But you're consistently the person, right? When USC was dominant, Pete Carroll was the face of that operation, even though, they had great players like Carson Palmer, Matt Leinart, Reggie Bush, Lendale White. All these guys went on to have pro careers. But they always looked at the coach as kind of the beacon, right? Boise State, when it was on their run about 20 years ago, was Chris Peterson. He was the face of that, right? And you see that all the way throughout. Saban was the face of Alabama, and right now Kirby Smart is the face of Georgia football, right? So they were so used to being looked at as this kind of this paragon figure, right? That they were the king of the castle, so to speak, in their universities. Whereas in the NBA and the NFL, it's a little bit more of a division of labor, right? Like you have a GM, you have the coach who kind of does the on the court stuff, you have scouts who kind of take a look at college tape, and you have a bunch of different positions available for people to do different jobs. It's much more segmented. While those people still talk, it's not as reticent and reliant on the top level person as it is in college. So the downside of this is that for so many years, these college coaches were the biggest things on their campuses. So they kind of controlled a lot of different elements of the university, because especially with football, that is going to drive so much revenue that they are kind of almost like a godlike figure in these small college towns. You think about, if you're the head coach of Michigan, and Michigan obviously cares about academics, but that football program is a national powerhouse and draws in a lot of revenue for the school. So between merchandise and ticket sales and all that different stuff, right? So they kind of had this thing where they could bring in as many recruits as they can. A lot of times in Alabama or Clemson would kind of recruit 3 or 4 of the top players at a position, sign those guys, and then just have guys in reserve, right? Just kind of stacking up scholarships and being able to just control everything, right? They had a lot of say-so into, who was getting recruited and anything that is done at the university. And a lot of times, even when they would do something wrong, they weren't really punished like that. So this is what they were used to. So if you're Saban, you've been coaching for the past 30 years. This is the environment you've had, right? You've had this kind of king of the castle vibe. And Saban went to the NFL. He tried the whole division of labor thing. Didn't really work out. A lot of times, a lot of coaches are incapable of doing that switch. And I think it's because in college, you're so in control. You have a hand in scheduling. You have a hand in talent acquisition. You have a hand in obviously selecting the coaches on the field. You have a hand in how funds are allocated. You're a part of all of it. And in the pros, it's just not the case. So for a while, for these coaches, it was all good, right? They're kind of type A personalities, maybe a little bit control freaks, and they're able to kind of dictate the terms here. Then NIL happens, right? So name, image, likeness, if you're unfamiliar with the acronym, where a player has the ability to get paid. Now, let's start off by saying this. The fact that especially the high-end men and women's basketball players and the football players were incapable and not allowed to profit off of their image. So basically, to sign an endorsement deal, to shoot a commercial, cashing in on the fame they have by playing a sport at a high level at a university. Was kind of ridiculous, right? Like, the line forever was, hey, you're getting your tuition for free. And let's use Caitlin Clark as an example. Tuition at a Big Ten school, typically $30,000 a year or so, depending on the university. $50,000 on the high end for out of state. Caitlin Clark was at Iowa for 4 years. You're trying to tell me she only generated $200,000 worth of value for Iowa? Absolutely not. She put that school on the map. She put women's college basketball on the map. She sold tickets, sold merchandise, sold all this stuff. She's worth to that university a lot more than 200 grand, right? And it's the same thing in football. People who go to Alabama games are coming to see the players. They're not coming, even though the coaches kind of have their hands in everything. They're not coming to see the coach. They're going to Alabama to see Ryan Williams. They're going to Georgia to see Carson Beck. It's just like they're going for these specific guys, and they have been unable to take advantage of that for so many years up until recently. Now, the issue with NIL, just like anything that happens to be a reform that's instituted in college football and college basketball, is that they've kind of gone off the deep end, right? The spirit of NIL has kind of been, hey, if that local car dealership or doctor's office wants to give you $10,000 to shoot a commercial, you're allowed to do that now, right? If you wanted to have your name in a video game and make money from EA Sports off of that, you can do that now. But what has happened is that these things have kind of started, and you're seeing like national NIL deals, like Caitlin Clark, had a State Farm deal while she was still at college. Angel Reese has had deals before she went to the WNBA, and then college football players have their local commercial deals, and they have, their national commercial deals as well. What's also happened now is that schools with boosters who have a lot of money have said, okay, what if we create a fund? And they create these NIL funds, and that's going to be like basically a purse of money to go after players. So basically, it's just throwing money at the problem. Bill Belichick, who just got hired by North Carolina. I think the reason he did the whole thing to go to UNC is because they have NIL money with their association with Michael Jordan and the Jordan brand, right? And amongst a bunch of other boosters who went to UNC, over the years. So it's kind of become this thing where it's kind of pay to play, right? Where I'm going to go into the transfer portal and I'm going to be a mercenary for the highest bidder. And while it's great that players are getting paid, I think especially at like a Power 4 conference that has a huge TV deal and that has a lot of eyeballs on it, paying a player makes sense. I think about Michigan's championship run last year, J.J. McCarthy and all that, and he was the face of that team. He deserved to be paid, right? As he was. And so it's kind of a thing where, like, yes, the players should get paid, but what was promised is not actually what's kind of happened. And I think that what we've ended up with here is the college system does what the college system does, which is find the loophole in the system, expose it, and kind of take advantage of it as much as you possibly can, and, make it suit your needs. So if you're, say, a school like Auburn, you're in Alabama, you're in a remote part of Alabama, there probably isn't a lot of local businesses offering a lot of money to the point of getting those players. But if you have enough NIL from, different alumni, that number increases and now you're able to attract players. Before, let's not be naive. Players are probably getting paid under the table before. We've seen it before with like SMU. We've seen it Florida State have that over the years. TCU's had violations, especially in the 80s. It was just rampant, right? But a lot of times you would kind of convince the player to come with a little bit of money, but also on the salesmanship of why they could get to the NFL from these universities. But now it's like you can kind of get to the NFL from just about anywhere if you have the talent, and so that's kind of what a lot of these kids are looking for. And I don't blame the kids, right? They're 18-year-olds, most of the time from a poor background, that are just trying to provide for their family and themselves and establish their careers. And if you're in college and the University of Oregon says, hey, here's $4 million to come play wide receiver for us, who are you to say no, But it brings us to this thing where Phil Knight, to mention Oregon, is, the owner and founder of Nike. He's been throwing a bunch of money trying to buy a national championship here. And we see Ohio State spending over $20 million, Texas spending $20 million. And this is, a number that's probably only going to increase. But it's been the Wild West, right? Like, one of the reasons that Larinaga decided to leave, he brought up an interesting point. Like, look, we made it to the Final Four, which, if you play college basketball, that's the goal, to compete for a national championship. And also to elevate your draft stock, which March Madness, if you play well during the tournament, does. So they get to the Final Four. And then a bunch of the guys enter the portal. And he's like, all right, well, I don't understand. What's the problem here? Do you not like and Miami is paying players. They have an NIL fund. Are you not happy here? Do you not like playing for Miami? And the players will say, no, we actually love it here. However, this school or that school is offering me this much more. And it's become a thing where they could just go because that was the deal. And that's where the whole guardrails thing comes into mind. Because right now you look at Matthew Sluka, the quarterback of UNLV, who entered the portal after a few games this year, and there's no repercussions for that. And that's in the middle of a year. And you're seeing that all over. You're seeing that in college football right now, where Penn State lost their backup QB because the opening of the transfer portal window collided with the timing of the college football playoff. So now a guy who's a part of Penn State's packages offensively, in certain rushing situations, they don't have that anymore because of the whole portal thing. And I think that from the perspective of you just can't even form relationships with players anymore, I see what the coaches are saying, right? I understand it from the perspective of, from Larinaga's perspective, where he's basically saying, hey, let's, what are we doing wrong? And the player literally will tell them, "You're doing nothing wrong. I've loved my time here. However, I'm going to go where the money is." And it leads me to wonder, it's like you're seeing a lot of the old guard of college sports kind of get fed up with this. And a lot of fans who consider themselves in that old guard are fed up with it as well. And then on the flip side of that, you have the new school, which is a little bit more like, well, you got to pay the players. You got to pay the players. You got to pay the players. And I'm not in the business of feeling sorry for a college, right? If you look at how much money colleges make in between like government subsidies and tuition costs and book costs and all this other stuff, they're a for-profit situation. But I have to imagine it's incredibly difficult if you're a coach, right? Because even like in the NFL, there's contracts. In the NBA, there's contracts, right? So it's not like the Sacramento Kings who just fired their coach Mike Brown. They signed DeMar DeRozan to, a multi-year deal this offseason. They can't get out of that right away. There's a repercussion for them to cut that player. And the player can't move because, again, he signed the contract agreeing to a certain amount of terms. In college, you could kind of sign on with the school, halfway, 5 games in, decide this isn't working for you, then enter the transfer portal, So I almost wonder if it should be almost like you have length of contracts here in college. And I'm not saying you sign a 4-year deal type thing, but like if it's like the way like the NBA has a 1+1, a 1 year fully guaranteed, and then the next year is like either a team or a player option, because you need a little bit more in place. You could also suggest that there should be a sort of salary cap, because right now you're getting a situation where the big schools are going to get all their alumni, former players that went there, who are going to donate to this fund. So what's going to end up happening? Michigan, Ohio State, Alabama, Georgia, Clemson. These type of guys are going to get this NIL money and be able to throw it at these high-end players. And because these mid-level schools won't be able to generate the same amount of money, there's going to be an erosion of the middle class here, right? And you could argue that that's always been there, but it's a challenging thing if you're building a program. And I just kind of think that we're getting to a point here where we kind of have to either institute some sort of salary cap, institute some sort of guardrails and limitations around NIL, mainly because, a lot of people say, well, that just benefits the universities. It also benefits the player, and here's what I mean by that. There was a quarterback who played for the University of Miami a number of years ago. I believe his last name was Van Dyke, and transferred to 5 different schools. And this was a guy who was a top 10 recruit, was kind of envisioned to be on a trajectory for the NFL. But as he kept on transferring and transferring and transferring, he kind of fell off the radar. And a lot of these guys who end up staying an extra year or extra 2 years at a school, they end up going through the adversity, building up the draft profile. And this is especially true in football, because in college basketball, you have one and done, right? So, that's not as much of a deal. But in football, they value staying with it a lot, especially at the quarterback position. Now, if you lose your coach and stuff, that's an understandable transfer. But I do think that there is something to be said about a player maintaining their high stock by staying at a place. And especially if the place has success, right? So if you're at a school, they're winning 7, 8, 9, 10 games, and you're just going to transfer for a little bit extra money, you really have to measure it. If you are a real NFL prospect, right? Let's say you're a wide receiver who's projected to be a top 3 round pick. You should stay at an Ohio State or a Georgia, a place that has kind of had a reputation for being a path to the pros. And that potential there, you would think, would outweigh an extra few $100,000 or $1 million even to go to another school for the short term. And I think it should be common practice moving forward for players to hire money managers if they are a high-level recruit playing big-time college football, because At the end of the day, these are 18, 19, 20-year-olds making these huge decisions over hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars. And I don't know about you, but when I was that age, I didn't know what the hell I was doing financially. So you throw that amount of money at me, yeah, I'm probably going to make some bad decisions, right? And I think that should probably be the norm moving forward. I think that you're still going to have some situation here where these coaches, they do need to adapt, right? Larinaga could say all that, but you have to kind of take the cards that are dealt and try and navigate within it. And a lot of other coaches have been better at that. I do think that we're getting to the point now where you might start seeing a lot of people who want to be like that old school idea of a coach go at lower levels. And I think there's a reason why Mike Vick and Deshaun Jackson have gone the HBCU route as opposed to like being coordinators in the NFL or for a bigger college and eventually take that into a head coaching position. At the FCS level and such, you're able to kind of still have teaching moments, I think, and the whole like molding men type thing. But I think that the big time jobs now are a little bit more professional in nature. You're managing salaries, you're managing egos of people who make a lot of money, and they're really young people who make a lot of money now, right? And I think it's just different. And so to me, the solution here is not to abolish NIL, not to abolish the transfer portal, but you kind of have to create a timeline that is in the off season. You have to kind of create financial guidelines and restrictions so it's not the Wild West. And I think college sports has been so comfortable in being the Wild West for such a long time that concept is hard for them to fathom. And I just think that a lot of people are tuning out a little bit to it, where they're just kind of like, oh yeah, that's just college, players in it for the money, everybody's a mercenary, no school pride. And I don't expect a player to have school pride, but I do respect a player who sees it through, right? And maybe you transfer after 2 years, but like the middle of the year transfer thing, it leaves a bad taste in my mouth because, it really does just say that a lot of these guys are just in it for the money, which I know most of them aren't, but it sends that message, and the message can be powerful. And the coaches now are throwing their hands up saying, well, I don't want to deal with this anymore. That also sends a message that they are just disgusted with the state of things. And I think both sides, both entities here, can meet somewhere in the middle, where it's not necessarily we have to abolish NIL, or it's not necessarily we just have to continue letting the 2,000 plus players enter the portal freely whenever they want type situation. So I feel like there's a middle ground here, and we should take what these coaches are saying who are kind of like on the quote unquote front lines, take it a little bit more seriously than that's just a crotchety old coach mad that they're losing control. Which part of that is probably true. But it can also be true that the system is kind of like a train off the tracks and is kind of a runaway situation. So I'm hoping to see some reform there. You wonder how that could happen, what the NCAA could do to institute that. But I think it's a desperately needed thing in the entire realm of college athletics moving forward. All right, everybody, that's going to wrap up another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. Thank you, as always, for tuning in. If you like the podcast, please be sure to check it out on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Spotify and YouTube video podcast now, so you could catch all this on video if you'd like, or just stick to the audio version as well. I hope everybody is enjoying this college football playoff and NFL playoff season. We will talk to you in the new year next week. So thank you as always for tuning in, and we will catch you next time on the Deep Cover Podcast.